start tonight by welcoming everyone to today's CCL training program. It's a weekly webinar program of Citizens Climate Lobbies that provides CCL supporters with access to in-depth training opportunities on topics relating to climate change and effective climate advocacy. I'm your host, Brett Cease, and tonight's topic is Social Psychological Framework for Citizen Climate Activists. Join psychologists David Sherman and Leif van Boven for CCL, and they were formerly CCL September 2018 monthly speakers, as they tonight are going to review the main findings and framework for their recent research. So with that, let me introduce our esteemed speakers tonight. We have the wonderful David Sherman. David is a professor of social psychology in the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences at UCSB. Dr. Sherman was an associate editor at the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, has served as president of the International Society for Self and Identity, and is currently the editor of Personality and Social Psychology Review. His research was supported by grants from the National Science Foundation, centers on how people respond to information and events that threaten the self. With David tonight is the wonderful Leif van Boven. Leif is a professor in the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience at the University of Colorado Boulder. And Leif's, Dr. van Boven's research lies at the intersection of social, environmental, and political psychology. He uses laboratory experiments, national surveys, and field studies to examine the processes that shape people's everyday lives. His research has been funded by the National Science Foundation, and he co-directs the Emotion, Decision, and Judgment and Identity Lab. And in addition to both of their writing for academic audiences, both of our esteemed speakers tonight have written broadly about psychology, politics, and the environment for the New York Times, LA Times, Washington Post, and many other outlets. We're going to be hearing about how that journey tonight led them to working with CCL. And I'll let them take that story from here after reviewing our three main learning goals. Attendees listening in will have the chance to deepen your own understanding of the psychological framework that really underlies our organizational approach. You'll have the chance to really learn some unexpected patterns, especially as we move to incorporate more effective strategies in our advocacy. And we'll have the chance to also invite all of us to reflect on strategies that we as climate advocates use so that we too can improve our approach. So with that, and we'll get the show on the road. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone, and we look forward to a wonderful hour together.
Well, thank you, Brett. Leif and I are delighted to be here with you to talk about our research and to hear everyone's feedback on this project. The theoretical background or theoretical framework is a social psychological approach. Leif and I are social psychologists. And as such, we study how people interpret situations and how this interpretation affects their feelings, their actions, and their behavior. Social psychology has a long tradition of action research to uncover basic social psychological insights that could be used to change behavior through theoretically informed interventions. And that's been a large goal of both of our research programs. And while the bread and butter of social psychology is laboratory studies, there's a strong tradition of field research, and we're excited to share our contribution to this. So a brief overview of our collective presentation. We're going to begin with a theoretical background, kind of elaborating on how we came to study this topic and work with CCL on this project. Then we're going to describe a framework for overcoming barriers to consensus. Then we will present data and findings from a study that we conducted around the 2018 election cycle. And then we'll turn it over to Brett to discuss some of the implications of these findings for advocacy and training, and join back together for a Q&A discussion. Okay, so to begin with our theoretical background, I'd like to give just a little background as to how I came to study climate change. I remember the first time I really heard about climate change was in the 1980s, and I was a preteen reading Sports Illustrated. And I love Sports Illustrated. I'd read it every week for the sports, but one issue, they had this article on climate change and what would happen. And it was a doomsday scenario of the coasts flooding, intense hurricanes, fires all over, uncontrolled. And it alarmed me, it scared me. It was this futuristic apocalypse that they were describing. Well, sadly, we are beginning to see the effects of this, and we have been seeing the effects of what was described as this futuristic kind of doomsday scenario. And so around 8 years ago, having been a social psychologist since entering graduate school in 1995, I decided to turn the efforts of myself and my laboratory and also begin to work with a longtime friend and collaborator, Boven, on how can we take a psychological approach, use the tools of social psychology to understand in different ways topics such as what leads to environmental behavior, how can you promote more effective and sustainable behaviors, and how can we understand the barriers to having effective climate policies. Okay, and so the fruits of this journey led to a paper that Leif and I and our graduate student, Philip Barrett, published in 2018 in the journal Perspectives on Psychological Science that was titled Psychological Barriers to Bipartisan Public Support for Climate Policy. Now, we firmly believe that bipartisan policy is the best way for lasting change to occur. And so we wanted to apply our social psych perspective to understand this. And so in addition to conducting national surveys in 2014 and 2016 in this paper and reporting on the results of those large experiments, we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment, we also interviewed former members of Congress, such as Republican Representatives Mickey Edwards and Democratic Senator Tim Wirth, about what they saw as the psychological barriers to bipartisan policy. So our goal has been to try to understand the psychological factors facing different elements of this puzzle, both the citizens, the legislators, and with this current project, the citizen activists who are engaging with the legislators. This project took about 5 years and was published in 2018. You can check out this and all of our papers on the web pages that Leif and I maintain at our universities. Okay, in addition to writing for the scientific audience, Leif and I are also interested in writing for the popular press to translate some of our findings into more mainstream outlets. And so we published some of the results of these studies that we conducted in an opinion piece in the New York Times that highlighted one of our key findings, that there was great consensus in climate change belief among Democrats and Republicans alike. So climate change belief is not sufficient to explain why there has not been bipartisan policy. There needs to be further understanding of what are the barriers beyond just changing people's beliefs. And so after publishing this in the Times, we were excited to get contacted by CCL out of the blue. And they wanted to hear more about this. And so if you want to hear our first talk, I believe this is still available, where we described some of these findings that we highlighted both in the New York Times op-ed and that first article. And that forms the theoretical framework for the research that we're going to be presenting today.
I haven't had a chance to thank everyone for being here, but thank you. We have really been inspired by the work that CCL does and how much it aligns with a lot of the theoretical grounding as we're going to talk about today. And I have to just quickly comment on that last slide. There's that screenshot of us on a Zoom call. And I remember when that happened in 2018, we were like, wow, isn't it neat that you can have a Zoom meeting with people from all over and deliver a talk? And now I'm like, wow, another Zoom call with people from all over delivering a talk. So you guys were early adopters. I want to tell you just a little bit about some of the work that we've done that was summarized in the papers that David mentioned, and really how this kind of shaped the way we think about what some of the major barriers are and where the greatest opportunities are for citizen lobbyists to kind of connect between ordinary public opinion and the actions that legislators may or may not take. So one of the key things that David mentioned was that our results really suggested that simply blaming Republican skepticism is not really a full explanation of why it has been difficult to enact climate policy. That actually, if you look closely at the data, what the data suggests is that the majority of Republicans, like the majority of Democrats and independents, do believe in climate change. They're concerned about climate change. And that kind of point is, we can't understate the importance of that the public has really come around from what we've maybe seen a decade or so ago. So just to give you a little bit of a detail of what the data look like here, these are statements that we gave to people from a nationally representative survey. We actually conducted this survey in the paper. We reported results from 2014 and 2016. And we just described to people a very brief summary of what climate change is. And then we asked them how much they agreed with these four statements: that climate change is happening, that climate change poses a risk to human health, safety, and prosperity, that human activity is largely responsible for recent climate change, and that reducing greenhouse gas emissions will reduce global warming. Now, one thing I just want to be careful to mention here, that these items are all really closely correlated. So by and large, people tend to agree with all of them to the same extent. What we don't see is that people agree with some and disagree with others. So we took these items, and because they're so closely correlated, we just averaged them together and we score them on a scale that ranges from -3 to +3. And what we see then when we look at the distributions of data is a couple of patterns. So the first pattern that maybe sort of catches everyone's eye is that if you look at this graph, which is really just reflecting the shape of the distribution of agreement with those four statements among Democrats in blue, Republicans in red, and independents in purple. And it does kind of look like the Democrats are standing out relative to Republicans. So that difference is there. But in many ways, the more important observation is that the average response and the majority of responses for all three groups, Democrats, Republicans, and independents, is on the agreement side of the distribution. So even though the average Republican agrees a little bit less strongly than the average Democrat, it nevertheless is the case that most Republicans are on the agreement side. They recognize the reality of climate change. They recognize that it's caused by humans and that reducing greenhouse gas emissions would address that. Just very recently, over the past almost day and a half or so, we have been analyzing data from a survey that we conducted in July of this year. A lot of things have happened over the past 4 years, and so we might wonder whether the world still looks the same with respect to these kind of patterns of belief. And we were actually really excited to see that we saw exactly the same patterns for Democrats and Republicans, that the clear majority in July 2020 agree that climate change is happening, express some concern about it, recognize that it is human caused. So this is not a pattern that has gone away, which I think is important to keep in mind. Okay, so with that kind of basic observation in mind, we discussed a number of psychological barriers to broader bipartisan support for implementing climate policy. And the first barrier is something that we refer to that people place party over policy. They really emphasize in their kind of public opinions, they emphasize partisan concerns instead of being concerned about the fundamental issues and the kind of fundamental concerns that might be addressed in the policy. And so one of the ways that social psychologists have studied these kinds of influences on people is they do experiments. And so we did an experiment modeled after work that our friend and colleague Jeff Cohen did a number of years ago. And what we did is we described a climate policy, and we experimentally manipulated whether we said the policy was coming from Democratic politicians or from Republican politicians. And what we found is that even though the policy was exactly the same, people were much more supportive of it when they believed it came from their own party than when they believed it came from the other party. So people were clearly reacting to whether it was a Democratic policy or a Republican policy over and above thinking about the policy itself. And so they were, as we refer to it, emphasizing party over policy. So that was one kind of major psychological barrier, that there are these partisan considerations that shape people's attitudes. A second and related psychological barrier relates to an exaggerated sense of partisanship. What we mean here is that when people think about how other citizens are influenced by these partisan considerations, they believe that other citizens are much more swayed by partisan considerations than they are themselves. So I might believe that other Democrats are much more sensitive to whether a policy comes from Democratic politicians or Republican politicians than I am myself. Similarly, if I were a Republican, I might think that my fellow Republicans might view a Democratic policy with much less enthusiasm than maybe I do. So in other words, people perceive other Democrats and Republicans as being much further apart than they actually are. And in fact, this is a pattern that pervades any number of kind of perceptions of political divisions in the United States. So they're actually much smaller than we perceive them to be. This then creates a problem because in many ways, it's our belief about what other Democrats and Republicans think that shapes our own responses as much as what they actually think. So if we misperceive these partisan divisions, it makes it difficult for us to cross party lines. It makes it difficult for us to adopt a stance that might seem at odds with our group. So we exaggerate this partisanship, and the exaggerated partisanship creates this false norm that can foment further partisan disagreement.
Okay, so identifying the barriers is one part of what our research paper sought to do. And a second is to review the psychological evidence as to what are some strategies for overcoming the barriers. And we focused on two in particular in this 2018 paper. The first was affirmation. The idea is that people are motivated to maintain a particular view of themselves, and they can often be defensive in response to threatening information. People want to be consistent, to be seen as consistent. So imagine you are a legislator who has resisted climate policy, supporting climate policy. Someone is coming to talk with you and presenting all this evidence as to why you should change and support this. The implications of this, for one, are threatening, that your prior intransigence could be leading to the ecological disaster that we're all experiencing. Another reason why you might want to be resistant to this is because you want to maintain this consistent view of yourself. It's very important for politicians not to be flip-flopping. So the psychological evidence kind of backs up these motivations. People have a desire, in many cases, to be consistent and are very resistant when other people are giving them information that contradicts a view of themselves that they like to maintain. What we found over decades of research is that if you can create an affirming context, give people an opportunity to feel as though they're good and capable, moral individuals, then presenting otherwise threatening information, it leads to less defensiveness and at times can lead to greater open-mindedness. Studies that have supported this, they have people, for example, write about core values that are important to themselves. And when people do this, they're reminded of who they are and what's important to them. And then if they're given subsequent threatening information, it doesn't have the same sort of self-evaluative stakes. And people are more open-minded to it and more willing to change their behavior. So a number of years ago, we summarized the implications of this for political ideology. There have been studies that we've conducted that have looked at it in terms of bridging partisan divides. We wrote an op-ed for the Washington Post that appeared on their online pages that summarized this research. we didn't get to choose the title. They chose the title, How to Reduce Partisan Gridlock, as if it was would be so easy. But while it isn't quite so easy, we're not proposing that this can reduce partisan gridlock. We do think that an affirming context that communicates respect for others and common values can create the psychological space for compromise. So in our 2018 paper, we actually cited the Citizens Climate Lobby, where we read about in the media the approach of the organization to the meetings that they have with members of Congress. So this is from our 2018 paper. The Citizens Climate Lobby took an affirming approach when meeting with a Republican congressional representative. They started by mentioning their appreciation for the representative's service in Iraq and in the state Senate before mentioning anything about climate change. So, and in response to this, the story goes, the Republican congressman said, I just have to say, you guys are not normal. You're smiling, you're saying nice things about me. That's not what people like you do when you come into my office. So this was such a departure from what was normative in the exchange between citizens and representatives that it really stood out to this representative. Well, that stood out to us as an example of how this affirming approach could be enacted. And the congressperson's reaction, he signed on to the Citizens Congressional Caucus, or the Climate Caucus, demonstrates the potential effect and importance of affirming common goodwill and establishing personal connections.
Okay, a second barrier that we discussed in the article relates to this idea of the kind of exaggerated partisanship. And it really reflects a sense that for many individuals, let's say many individuals in particular on the Republican side, the stereotype is that Republicans don't care about the climate. They're not concerned about climate change. And this can create a situation where people really feel isolated from other people within their group. And so given that, it becomes really critically important to convey accurate information about what other people in your political group actually do believe about climate change, because it helps reduce that feeling of being isolated, that you are really in the minority. It helps you recognize that there are many other people like me, and that even though we may share this stereotype that people on our side don't really care about the climate, that turns out to be wrong, and that frees people up to be more open and honest in expressing their concerns about it.
So that's a background, a bit of background on our prior research. And this was elaborated on in our 2018 paper and in our prior talks with CCL. And after we had that meeting, we started talking with Brett and Mark Reynolds and others about doing a study with citizen climate activists. And so this was recently published. This was published last month, online first. And this is, the paper's titled The Exchange Between Citizens and Elected Officials, a Social Psychological Framework for Citizen Climate Activists. And our collaborators on this project are Michelle Stein, who's a PhD student at University of California, Santa Barbara, and Professor Hari Han, who is a faculty member at Johns Hopkins University and a CCL advisory board member. And the exchange between citizens and elected officials is something that's rarely studied in our field of social psychology. And we really think it's a ripe situation for social psychological analysis. The goals of persuasion are very clear. You have issues of identity defense. You have the opportunity to express and maybe even to change norms. And these are some of the topics at the heart of our field of social psychology. So the goals of our paper were both to review the relevant literature and to conduct a study with citizen activists. And citizen activists are important, obviously, because they translate the public concern about climate to decision makers and policymakers with the goal of elevating climate on the political agenda. And when we think of citizen climate activists, most people around the world probably immediately think of someone like Greta Thunberg, the Swedish teenager who mobilized hundreds of thousands of people in turn to strike for climate and to make this on the forefront of the agenda passionately. And such citizen activists play this unique role in the political process by providing countervailing pressure against, for example, corporate lobbyists or other institutional interests on behalf of climate policy. But citizen activists also include people who don't have the international spotlight of Greta, but instead work behind the scenes to advocate for climate policy at all levels of government. And so we began our paper, this most recent paper, with a quote by a CCL member, Alyssa Chindra. And she noted in a letter to the editor, to the Daily Camera, a Colorado newspaper, that there's a revolutionary importance in the relationship between us citizens, us people citizens, and our leaders. And this exists at all levels, whether members of Congress, mayors, or city council members. People in positions of power hold the key to inducing change. And this is really the key point. And by creating relationships with these leaders, we're granted the opportunity to voice our opinions and push towards a solution necessary to put an end to climate change. And so the same goal exists for these different activists. They're really complementary approaches to creating lasting climate policy. As I said, two goals in the paper. The first was to review the literature to think about different psychological strategies that would be relevant in the context of citizens advocating for, in this case, climate policy with their elected officials. Thinking about that very unique situation where you have interpersonal contact between yourself advocating for a cause, advocating for climate policy, and your elected officials. What are some of the psychological theories? What are some of the findings that are relevant to this? And so we propose in the paper that four main strategies. There are others from the literature that you could derive, but we thought that these four would be particularly powerful and important to think about. The first one is affirmation, which I described a little bit before. And the idea, again, behind the affirmation approach is that if you affirm shared values between yourself and the person you're talking to, it has a potential to reduce defensiveness and promote open-mindedness and dialogue. For example, one study we conducted in the run-up to the 2008 election found that the partisan divide among people who were evaluating the presidential debate at that time between Senator John McCain and Senator Barack Obama, that partisan divide between Republicans and Democrats was reduced among people who had an opportunity to affirm something else that was important to them. That is, being in a more affirmed state where you're reminded of something of key importance that's unrelated to politics made people more open-minded to the other side. Now, I do not know whether this would have worked with the debate earlier this week, but the general idea that we found across many studies is that affirmation can reduce inflexibility and promote more open-mindedness. The second strategy, which Leif also described earlier, but made more concrete, is that providing accurate information about the descriptive norms, about what people actually believe related to carbon pricing policies, can dispel misinformation. One of the most powerful motivators of action is social norms. One of the congressmen we interviewed for that earlier paper said that nobody wants to be an outlier, particularly from their group. And there's a long history of research in environmental and social psychology led by Robert Cialdini and his colleagues that have shown that to promote green behavior, one of the most effective tools that we have is communicating the actual norms that most other people espouse green values and engage in green behaviors. And because people don't want to be an outlier in terms of their important groups, they're more likely to conform to these norms and change their own behavior.
Also, in reviewing the literature, identified two strategies that we haven't really talked about yet, but will feature importantly in the results of the study that we conducted. The first one has to do with emphasizing legacy, inviting people to think about the costs and benefits to future generations. The cost of not taking action to address climate change and the benefits that might accrue if we were actually to take action on climate change. And there are a host of reasons why people tend to be very narrowly focused on the present. And I'm sure you've encountered this in your work, but it's really quite natural for people to think in the very short term and to think primarily about themselves. And so one of the fundamental challenges of climate change is that it involves a future that feels very far away. And moreover, it involves a future that is likely to primarily involve other people. And so there are kind of two knocks against getting people to care about it. But it turns out that we can help people become more concerned about other times and other people by really inviting them, as I said, to think about their legacy, to think about how the actions they take today will impact future generations. There was at least one series of studies that showed that if you simply ask people to think about future generations, they were more likely to buy environmentally friendly consumer products, for example. And we think this works in a couple of ways. One is that when we think about legacy, it, in a sense, affirms our values of being concerned about future generations, right? We think about our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren. The other thing that it does is it brings the future closer. So it makes it feel like it's less far away, like it's actually relevant to what we are doing today, what will happen in the coming decades. And then the fourth strategy is kind of the counterpart to thinking about legacy, and that is recognizing that we are seeing the effects of climate change right now. And this probably doesn't need much elaboration, because obviously we're seeing those consequences right now, as David said in his opening example, that in many ways the public discussion on this has changed over the years. This climate change is no longer something that will happen only in the future, and helping people to see that we can actually connect these extreme weather events that we're seeing right now to climate change, that it's here, can provide some additional emotional motivation. That sort of fear and anxiety about we need to do something can really provide the impetus toward taking action on climate policy.
In the paper, we have sections on each of those strategies that you can refer to kind of dive deeper into what has been done in the social psychological literature, some of the nuances to the findings, and can serve as kind of an introduction to the field of social psychology. And so part of the paper then was to review the literature of these four strategies and present them as one body. The second part of the paper then was to see whether or not citizen activists resonate with these strategies, whether or not they recognize them in some sense, and whether or not they use them, feel as though they're effective, and think about them in ways that are kind of similar to the psychological literature suggests, in some ways different. And so to do this, we partnered with the organization to conduct an online study around the time of the 2018 midterm elections. And so the design of the study, we had 264 participants, all CCL members and activists, who voluntarily participated, and we're appreciative for their time, completed a pre-test before the November 9th election and prior to going to Washington, D.C. In lobbying. And then 292 completed post-test after the election in lobbying efforts in Washington, D.C. And that left 204 of those who completed both the pre-test and the post-test. We're going to focus more on the post-test results, that is, people's evaluation after they engaged in lobbying with their members of Congress. But the paper includes some results from the pre-test about how people anticipated using the different strategies. And the method for our study was to present activists with these psychologically grounded strategies that we derived both from theory, which we just explained, and from our study of the organizational practices. Okay, so our research assistant team reviewed some of CCL's training materials and tried to see how they were grouped along the lines of the four principles or the four strategies from the psychological framework that we're presenting. And so we worked together, and Brett was very helpful, and our goal was to not present these kind of abstract conceptual ideas such as affirmation, but to present them in terms of the methods and approaches that CCL, that the organization is already using, but to group them within these conceptual frameworks. Okay, so affirmation then was described as this. And so this is the actual materials that participants evaluated. And I'd like you to consider how you employ these practices in the course of your work. So we didn't use the psychological jargon of affirmation. Instead, we emphasized establishing shared values. That is, values of optimism, the importance of relationships, integrity, and being nonpartisan, in a context to highlight that staff and volunteers share a common ground and can work together towards public support for policy solutions grounded in these values that can manage the risks of climate change. So to come in with this optimistic approach, that democracy is a tool that can be used for solutions for climate change, to be respectful. And as we saw in that example with the Republican congressman from Florida, to express appreciation for prior service. To not be expressing opinions, but to do a lot of factual information, to present the detailed, knowledgeable information to the congressional representative. And a strong value of being nonpartisan, welcoming everyone, working with different officials on different ends of the political spectrum, meeting people where they are and trying to get them to move in the direction of supporting climate policy. And so the purpose of establishing shared values is to demonstrate that volunteers want to work with the member and their office to arrive at solutions grounded in their valid concerns toward addressing climate change, to appreciate that others have these concerns. And the psychological insight, again, is that this could create a context where people could feel more comfortable accepting what may be politically difficult or psychologically difficult information. The strategy of norms was described in terms of being a trusted messenger, someone who communicates to the representative the actual information about where their constituents are in terms of their climate change beliefs. So by sharing constituent letters and communicating information about the data that Leif presented earlier in some forms, in which many surveys have shown, and can be shown at the level of a particular congressional district. This is how many people in your congressional district believe in climate change and believe that it is important to address it via public policy. This also involves the impressive list of notable US business organizations who support the carbon fee and dividend, which was the sort of focal point of the 2018 meetings with legislators, including as evidence newspaper editorials and letters to the editor. And the purpose of being a trusted messenger is to dispel misinformation about support for carbon pricing policy by showing the actual support. Okay, so very much related to that idea of dispelling the false norms and replacing those with the accurate information about how much popular support there is for climate policy.
For the legacy strategy, there is sort of a combination of two themes here. So the overarching goal is to present the long-term costs and benefits associated with climate change and potentially of not addressing climate change. And we saw that there were a couple of ways in which this was expressed. One was simply to have volunteers tell their personal stories about how the climate has already affected them, and to talk about what the long-term costs would be for their own experience with future generations. So to really personalize it, and also to couple that with a discussion of kind of economic studies that talk about the long-term costs of failing to address climate change and or the benefits of enacting climate policy. So there were a number of examples, such as the regional economic modeling study that sort of talked about what happens if we think out into the future somewhat. And in the final strategy, emphasize these issues of extreme weather events and climate immediately affecting the experiences that everyone is having. And in a number of the training materials, there were descriptions about how it's now become clearer that we can make this scientific connection between climate change and what we see happening in the extreme weather today.
Okay, well, we're excited to share some of our data and findings with you all. And the first question, and this is the assessments of participants after they engaged in their congressional lobbying. Okay, so everyone in this was went to Washington, D.C. and met with their congressional representative. On average, about half of them met with Democrats and about half of them met with Republicans. And we asked them, how much did you use each of these strategies on a scale from not at all to a great deal, so a 5-point scale. And here are frequency counts of how many people reported using each strategy to this different extent. As you can see on the one on the left, using the shared values and affirmation, this was the most used strategy. Okay, that is almost 97% used it at least a little. And the modal response, 56%, used it a great deal. Okay, so communicating shared values really seems to be a core element of the approach of the activists, and it was used widely by participants. The second most commonly used strategy was the strategy of being a trusted messenger, kind of related to dispelling false norms. Here, 85% used it at least a little. 18% said that they used it a great deal of the time. Okay, if you look now at the lower two, emphasizing the long-term effects of climate change and describing extreme weather, these were used much less frequently. So 30% reported not using each of those strategies, and very few participants reported, relatively speaking, using those strategies a great deal. So the first thing we learned is that there's great variability in how much people reported employing each of these strategies. And so the next question that we wanted to address then is, how did participants perceive their meetings as going? Were they effective at changing the opinions of the congressional representative they met with?
So we're going to dive a little bit more into the data here. And I'm going to take just a moment to explain what's happening in this graph because it might not be super intuitive. We asked participants to indicate their perceptions of how much that particular congressional office was supportive of the policy at the beginning of the meeting and then also at the end of the meeting. So we have these assessments of whether there was movement in a positive direction or a negative direction. And the way we can see that here in this scatter plot is on the x-axis, we have the ratings that people made of where they thought the office was at the start of the meeting. And then on the y-axis, we have the ratings of where they thought the office was at the end of the meeting. So if everyone thought you just sort of stayed where you were, the dots would all line up on that diagonal line. And in fact, most of the people who completed the survey said they thought that the office ended up at about the same place that they started. But we can see that among those who shifted, about 30% said that they perceived increased support for the policy, and 12% then indicated that they actually perceived decreased support for the policy. So, one of the questions we want to entertain is, how do you not be in that 12%, to put it mildly? Looking at these responses, we're going to look at two versions of the question. So one is, how do perceptions of where the congressional office stands at the beginning of the meeting associate or correlate with the use of different strategies? And so what we've presented here are for each of the 4 strategies that we summarized. We have separate averages of how much people reported using that strategy for 3 different groups, whether they perceive the office as the congressional office as opposed, giving a 1 or 2, in the middle, or as supportive. And you see, as David was summarizing earlier, that by and large, the use of the affirmation, the shared values, is the more commonly used strategy. It's reported more strongly, more frequently than the other 3 strategies. But we noticed something that was really interesting and important to really understand better, and that was the shared values and affirmation strategy depended somewhat on where people perceived the office as being at the start of the meeting, that they were more likely to use that strategy when they perceived the office as already supporting the policy than when they perceived the office as opposing the policy. And you'll remember that we talked earlier about how this affirmation is really a critical way to kind of reduce defensiveness. It's one of the ways to sort of highlight the commonality and shared values of discussing the issue of climate. And yet we see that when the congressional office was seen as less supportive, people were less likely to report using that strategy. So another way to think about this is that people are using it less in the context where it is likely to be the most effective. And that presents a question that we think is worth delving into in future consideration and work.
Okay. So the next way that we looked at the data was to see whether any of the strategies was particularly associated with perceived increases in support among the congressional representatives. So remember in the graph that Leif presented, along the y-axis it had their support at the end of the meeting, and along the x-axis it had their support at the beginning of the meeting. So here we're trying to understand what leads to that support at the end of the meeting. And we're seeing how related that is to the use of each of those 4 strategies. Okay. So we put them into a multiple regression, including their initial support as a factor. And we saw which one is most predictive of their support at the end of the meeting. As you can see, the arrow there pointing to the coefficient for long-term legacy, that was the strongest among the 4 predictors. So those who used legacy the most, okay, those who appealed to the sort of focus on the long-term effects of climate change, they perceived the most change from the beginning of the meeting until the end of the meeting. It was associated with increases in support they perceived among the congressional representative. looking at them all, none of the other ones was associated with changes from pre-test to post-test. Okay. Now, if you recall, legacy was one of the strategies that was used the least, relatively speaking, to the other. And yet, participants, activists, felt as though that when they used it, the congressional representative was more receptive. And we thought this was interesting and worthy of future study as well. One reason why legacy may have been successful is that it emphasized not just the long-term costs of climate change, but also the long-term economic benefits for generations to come for putting a price on carbon. And that might have been one of the reasons why this was particularly effective at leading to changes among those who had room to change, those who initially didn't support the policy. Okay, well, as with every study, there are certain caveats and limitations, and so we just want to express them here for you. The first one is the dictum that correlation does not equal causation. The associations between use of a particular approach and effectiveness does not necessarily imply that adopting that approach will increase support for the policy. I mean, it may only for certain groups, and we can't tell from this study directly. Okay, we're only observing a correlation that those who used it more perceived a greater change. However, the research review of our paper does highlight studies that provide stronger causal evidence for the related psychological approaches. And so you can take the kind of package together if you read the paper and see the prior research that has more experimental control. Second limitation is that the outcome variable of perceived support, that was based on a retrospective assessment of the meetings by participants. It is not the actual support. We don't know the actual support or whether there was actual change among the representative in their movement towards supporting the policy. And we also relied on the intuitive use of these strategies. That is, the assessment that participants made of their strategies. We don't have objective measures of the meetings themselves to corroborate what the participants said. Nevertheless, we think that those intuitions as to what people used and their effectiveness are important and revealing in and of themselves.
Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the implications for how to improve the effectiveness of citizen lobbying activities. And one really simple suggestion that is supported by a growing body of psychological research is that it's very effective to have a checklist that you can run through to really just assess whether you are engaging in the strategies that you intend to be engaging in, whether you are pursuing all of the goals that you have set for a particular meeting. These kind of ideas are really nicely described in Atul Gawan's book, The Checklist Manifesto. And part of what he does is he talks about how in many contexts we can distinguish between two types of errors that people make. One type of error is when you just don't know what to do. You don't even know what the right strategy is. One of the things that happens in educational context is you learn what the right strategies are. So we hope to eliminate that error. The other error, the kind that in many ways is more troubling, is that we know what to do, but we don't do it. We know what the right way to act is, but in the moment, we don't sort of fulfill those intentions to behave in that right way. We know from some other pilot data that there are a number of strategies that people perceive as being effective that they don't actually implement. And similarly, there are strategies that they don't perceive as particularly effective, but they spend a lot of time engaging in. And so there's a kind of mismatch when they have cooler heads to reflect on what has happened, where they're not actually doing the things that they believe would be most successful. We can design some intervention, some relatively simple kind of structured introspection frameworks to help minimize these kinds of errors of not using what we know. And it's a very simple strategy of providing kind of a theoretical framework of the kind we have suggested here, that we have these sort of 4 overarching themes or strategies, and then to occasionally and repeatedly ask, am I enacting this strategy in the way that I intend to? To do that sort of mental checklist, and if you come up short, then you have an opportunity to fix that. But to do that on a more regular, ongoing basis. And we found in a number of pilot studies that this kind of procedure can help people respond in a less partisan way. So it reduces a pattern that we refer to as reactive evaluation. And we found in other contexts that this sort of structured introspection can help people realize that they really want to be more concerned and caring about other people, and can help them behave less selfishly, for lack of a better term. So it's a very simple way of structuring your reflection that can bring about real behavior changes in the act of engaging in these lobbying efforts. I will make just a very quick note that the paper that we recently published is part of a special issue of papers in a special issue journal on behavioral climate policy. So it's a number of scholars from the field of social psychology, behavioral economics, who are considering different psychological considerations in how to design and implement climate policies that would be most effective. So we are going to host a remote conference, as all conferences are these days, on Friday, October 23rd. There will be links in the slides and distributed in the newsletter that will tell you how to register for that conference. We welcome everyone, and we are strongly encouraging all the speakers to bear in mind it's a conference that will be attended by both academics and broader audiences as well.
And with that, we'd like to thank you all for joining us tonight. We'd also like to acknowledge our collaborators again, Michelle Stein and Hari Han. Thank all of the participants who took the time to do our survey, participate in our study, and to thank Brett, who has been instrumental in this project. And with that, we'll turn it over to Brett.
The key thing I wanted to say, and I realize we have used and will continue to use these underpinnings across all 4 of the strategies that David, Leif, and the whole team have identified in 3 key areas. CCL, in our work with onboarding new volunteers, especially stresses the importance of affirmation with those shared values, the importance of really understanding that leads to lowering defensiveness, and with that comes more effectiveness. We put that front and center as well with the legacy stories that we practice in our Save versus Savor activities. We have ongoing leadership development opportunities, and these will continue to emphasize a lot of the main findings from the social psychological framework, as well as earlier a lot of the work that David and Leif have done in really teasing apart that exaggerated partisan perception of really being further apart than we actually are in our work together, building bridges as a nonprofit composed of volunteers across the aisle. And we do lots of work in preparing for our lobby training, both those norms and immediacy frames and strategies, not only being a source of information, but showing the norms, who in the community is already signing on in support. We are having conversations about developing an experimental checklist or that grid that Leif just reviewed, really to help identify the situation that was highlighted and not using what we know more effectively. And so stay tuned in our work on that. But with that, we've reached the end of the training, and we are so incredibly grateful, David and Leif, and the whole research team and work that you've put in for years in helping us understand and really affirm our approach, as well as helping us push ourselves further to be more prepared and effective lobbyists. So I know I speak on behalf of everyone that's listening live tonight on both of our channels, as well as the many hundreds that are going to be tuning in on their own time in the week and 2 ahead, how grateful we are for you taking the time to walk us through and really help each of us become more informed and effective citizen advocates.
Thank you very much. We are really privileged to be part of this.
Yes, thank you. We really value the work that is going on here, so thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Citizens Climate Lobby's training program. You can tune into more episodes anywhere podcasts are available. Inspired by what you heard today? Join Citizens Climate Lobby to advocate for bipartisan climate solutions. Go to community.citizensclimate.org to find more trainings, resources, your local chapter, national action teams, discussion forums, and more. Be sure to like our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and Instagram @CitizensClimate. We also invite all of our listeners to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiration. And together, we are creating the political will for a livable world.